everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Charles Lipson, Professor Emeritus at the University of Chicago. Charles, thank you so much for joining me.
It's always a pleasure, Brittany.
It's always a pleasure talking with you as well. And right now, we are sitting in a historic time, an unprecedented time. I know we keep saying that, but it is true. Former President Donald Trump was convicted on Thursday on all 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. Can you first talk about the significance of the verdict here?
It's huge. First, I would say that 34 is itself a political statement. That is, it was really one count that was repeated 34 times. So imagine that you walked out of a store, you stole something from a store, you shoplifted, you walked out and you had 34 items in your bag. They could charge you with shoplifting once, or they could charge you with shoplifting for all 34 items. And that's kind of what they did. But the reason it's so big is twofold. One, it's yet another wedge in the American population. And I'll give you an example in a second. And the other is that there are a lot of people who still have a residual respect for the U.S. judicial system. And they think, well, a fair-minded judge sits on these cases, and ordinary people like me sit in the jury, and they hear a lot more than I do. And if they make a decision, I should respect that. So the question politically, I think, is one, how much does this motivate the bases of the two parties? And I think and the answer is a lot. And then but it will motivate the Republicans more. And it will also, I think, in many cases, take people who were Republican but not so sure about Trump and say this is unfair and we're coming over to him. So some Nikki Haley voters. But I think the biggest issue, and let me put it concretely, the biggest issue is if you're a suburban independent voter in outside of Philadelphia or Detroit or Milwaukee, three crucial swing states where we normally think Trump has to win one of those three to win the election. The question is, what do they think about it? Will it move them one way or the other?
Do you think it will move them one way or the other? Because now Trump does have the title of convicted felon. Does a voter, an independent voter, get so offended by this that they choose not to vote for him?
I think there will be we don't know, but I think that what we will see is a battle of the media, with all the mainstream media saying, oh, this is terrible. Oh, he's the worst. Oh, he's a convicted felon. And the right-wing media or the conservative media will say, we don't know the underlying crime. He was convicted on something we don't know of. That's a violation of the Constitution. You have to know what you're really charged with. And they will also say it was a political prosecution. What he's fundamentally accused of was something that Hillary Clinton essentially acknowledged doing when she paid for the fake Russian dossier and wrote that off as a campaign contribution with a payment to her lawyer, Mark Elias. And so the Federal Election Commission gave her a small fine. They chose not to even prosecute Trump for the same thing. So Alvin Bragg ginned this up into something very political. And the New York Times will play it one way. But I think a lot of media, certainly all the conservative media, including media that was not associated with Trump, like the National Review, have just been livid about this. Not a little angry, not this could go one way or the other, They think this is like that major league umpire who was just thrown out because he couldn't call balls and strikes. They just think this is awful. Let me give you one more example on the other side. I live near the University of Chicago. It's a very liberal area in a deep blue state. And last night, right after the election, one of my neighbors held a party on her front porch to celebrate the verdict. And I'm going to go to a lunch today that's going to be filled with people who think that the truth is whatever they say on MSNBC. And I'll look forward to hearing how they see it. But they basically see it's not so much that they even concentrate on the case itself. They will say, oh, yeah, it was proven. But they just think, orange man bad. He should be put in jail.
I think that the ad for President Biden pretty much writes itself, because there were 34 counts, all of them guilty. If you flip to any news channel, the anchor was reading count 1, guilty, guilty, guilty. I mean, he can just splice that up 34 times and run that as an ad. But if you're voting for Biden, you're part of the base, the Democratic base. It's not like this is changing your opinion of Trump. You weren't voting for him to begin with. If you're part of Trump's base, you're pretty much unmovable. So how much really is this a political liability for Donald Trump?
Again, we just don't know. Let me give you a concrete example of that. I think a lot of people will look back to the O.J. Simpson trial, right, in which there was a deep division in the country. In that case, it was a racial division. I can remember it well because I went into the political science main office at the University of Chicago, where I was teaching at an office down the hall, and most people were kind of silent about it. But there was a person I had a very high regard for, African American. She was the chief administrative assistant in the office, and I closed the door and I asked her, could she say privately what she thought? She thought he was absolutely innocent. And I think the polling showed that over 80% of African Americans thought he was innocent. It may have been as high as 90. What's interesting, and well over 80, maybe 90% of whites thought he was guilty. What's interesting is that over time, the African American, if you poll them, they now, a vast majority think O.J. Simpson was guilty. So people's opinions change over time. I think in the case of O.J. Simpson, and the reason that I'm bringing it up is not only that it divided the country, but there was a sense that people divided into their clusters, into their packs, and they didn't want to disagree with their packs. There weren't people who were living on our block who thought Trump is bad, but I don't want to go to this party because I don't think this was a good conviction. I don't think this was right. I think they will do what you said, Brittany. And if you were going to vote for Biden, you were still going to vote for Biden. If you're going to vote for Trump, you were still. But I think it will increase the turnout, maybe for both candidates, but certainly for Trump. And there's an interesting question about whether it will help him peel off groups that feel, I think often accurately, that they've been mistreated by the U.S. justice system, and that begins with African American men.
What do you think this does for independent voters? Because this is an election that many are saying comes down to turnout, comes down to independent voters. They see now that Donald Trump is a convicted felon. You know, is this changing hearts and minds so much that this is the issue that they will cast their vote on, or is this just a piece in a larger puzzle?
It's the latter. It's the piece in a larger puzzle. But I think it's an important piece for the Democrats, who until now, excuse me, until now had only one issue, which was abortion. This gives them a second issue, and they will run with it until the election. There won't be time, excuse me, there won't be time, I think, for any appeal to go forward to a conclusion. The Trump team will make the appeal. But I remember Harvey Weinstein's conviction on one of the trials that he was convicted of. He'll be in jail till he dies. But one of the convictions in New York was overturned by an appellate court in the last couple of months because the judge allowed in evidence that should never have been allowed into that trial. And there are a number of potentially reversible errors, according to lawyers who seem to know the case. I'm not a lawyer, but they say there were all kinds of things that were allowed in and testimony that should never have been given. It seemed to me from the outside that the judge was part of the prosecution team. It was just not a fair-minded judge. And that's particularly important in a venue like Manhattan, where over 90% of the people voted against Trump. He starts with a huge negative weight on his shoulders, and that weight was amplified by the fact that the by two things. Final arguments didn't lead immediately to a sequestered jury that could have made a decision in 2 or 3 days, we now know. The judge gave them a week off so they could go home and talk to all their family. They were not supposed to, but how could they avoid it? They were not supposed to go on the internet. How could they avoid it? Or watch TV? How could they avoid it? That, in the environment of New York City, that really created a problem. The second thing is that New York has an unusual way of concluding trials. It lets the prosecution have the last word, so the defense can't rebut it. But the prosecution hid the ball for the entire trial about what the underlying crime was. Remember, the things that Trump was accused of were misdemeanors on which the statute of limitation had run out. It only becomes a crime if it can be tied to some underlying crime. But what was the crime? We still don't know. The prosecution, in the final summation, hinted that it was, and more than hinted, that it was election interference. But they didn't really present any evidence. They're not supposed to testify. They didn't present any real evidence that that's what it was. And the judge prevented the defense from calling what's probably the world's greatest expert on U.S. election law on the Trump side to say, no, he didn't, this isn't an election law violation. Judge blocked that for reasons that are still unclear. And so I think there's going to be a real question here about whether this was a fair trial and whether it'll be overturned on appeal.
What you're talking about, those jury instructions, they did cause a big stir on social media, but that is New York law, that the jury can come to a different conclusion. That isn't special for Trump. But what you're saying, this response has been very united in the GOP of, hey, we think this is rigged. We think this is a sham. The Democrats have been united in saying, well, no one's above the law. President Biden has had a more muted response to this. He did not come out with a press conference or anything since the verdict, and he posted this on X. There's only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office: at the ballot box. Donate to our campaign today. And then the Biden White House said, we respect the rule of law, reportedly. So that's what they reportedly said. What do you make of President Biden's strategy of being somewhat muted on this, not doing this overt victory lap.
That's really smart, and that's what he should do. Um, and it was wrong of them, of the campaign, to send Robert De Niro. He did to fulminate outside the court. That was clearly a campaign thing. They have a second reason to do it. It's not only smart in and of itself. They're going to have a problem with Hunter Biden, who goes on trial, not first for guns and then for tax evasion. And so the more he says respect all the, he's a convicted felon, this and that and the other, it undermines sort of Hunter. Now, Hunter is not an elected official, and parents aren't ultimately responsible for the acts of their adult children. The problem is that the GOP has depicted, and I think with quite a lot of evidence, that Hunter was the bag man for the family. And so he's one of life's little rules is don't let a drug addict be your bag man. He may not be reliable when he gets to court. And that's kind of a problem. It's also a problem, you notice, that 4 years later, the government has finally said that the laptop of Hunter's is not only real, but that they're going to present it in court as authentic evidence. And remember, it wasn't just that everybody who was on the Biden team had said it was fake. And that organization was led by Anthony Blinken, who in effect got the Secretary of State job because he organized that behind the scenes. And there were 51 people. But Joe Biden himself said it in a debate. He said it was fake. And all he had to do was ask his son. So I think that there is some vulnerability on that side. But I think that the biggest vulnerability of Biden remains the economy and immigration. And immigration, I view, Brittany, as part of a larger, there's disorder in the country. And you'll see a fight, actually, about the Democrats saying Trump is an agent of disorder, and the Republicans saying disorder is occurring under Biden and you won't get rid of it unless you get rid of him.
We're sitting right now 5 months away from Election Day. So everything can change. We're going to see the conventions. We're going to see 2 debates that are planned. Do you think this will even register with voters in November, or will this be so baked in? Because we have seen Trump just cross so many Rubicons here.
Exactly. I think it will still be big, and I think it will still be big because both sides will make it that way. Republicans are outraged, and the Democrats will keep nailing, do you want to have a convicted felon sitting in the Oval Office? So, yeah, I think it'll be big. But I think the more big events occur between now and then, the less important it will be. There will be riots at both conventions, and those will be riots from the left, and they will hurt. They hurt the Democrats both because it's the incumbent party and because it's the party of the left. We also have a huge number of gotaways who have immigrated into the country, not even been apprehended, and it only took 19 to take down the World Trade Center. So we don't know if there'll be a black swan event, a really unusual event that will somehow shape, it could be an attempted shooting of a candidate. It could be a terrorist event. It could be any number of black swan events, and those will also shape the election. Doesn't look like there will be any interest rate cuts. It doesn't look like the economy will make some dramatic turn for the better, but it could always take a more dramatic turn for the worse.
We are 5 months away, and a lot of people have been saying, although we see a conviction yesterday, this is the beginning, not the end. Are you suggesting that you think we are going to see some political violence after this verdict?
I would be surprised if you saw political violence right now that was started by pro-Trump people. But I think there will be violence around the conventions, and I think if there is violence around the conventions, there could be pushback from these right-wing crazies, not because they're pro-Trump, but because they just like violence and they like disorder, and as does Antifa and so forth. There could also be more disruptions in the autumn on college campuses because it doesn't look, according to what Israeli officials say, doesn't look as if the war will be over in Gaza by then. And if it's not, you will see more of those protests. So I think the country is in a very delicate position now, and it's not just because of one thing, but it's because we've seen a lot of disruption since the BLM riots in 2020, mostly peaceful.
I want to talk about, before I let you go, Donald Trump and his campaign released a statement that he reportedly saw a historic $34.8 million in small dollar donations in the less than 24 hours from the verdict. And the campaign said that 29.7% of the donors are new to the platform when read. Are you surprised by this?
I'm not. And in fact, there were so many people who went on to the website that the site crashed from overuse. So, but I think it's a big deal that there are new donors, and that does surprise me a bit. I mean, the fact that he got a lot of donations doesn't surprise me. The fact that he got new donations does, because I think what that says is that people who are not already motivated in his camp think this was an unfair trial. But I've got to say, I do have friends across the political spectrum, and I wrote an article that appeared in Spectator World immediately after the verdict, and I said this is not only damaging to Trump, it's damaging to the New York courts, and it's damaging to our court system. And from two people who are on the left, who are friends of mine, I mean, I know them well, so they weren't just anonymous people. They both sent literally one-line statements. One said, "You're kidding," and the other said, "Sour grapes." And so they don't even think it's worth debating. It's so obvious. And I must have gotten, 100 letters from people who read the article and just said, "This is an outrage." The conviction, not my article, the conviction was an outrage. And so I do think it deeply splits the country in a way we haven't seen really in a long time. And it comes on top of already existing deep divisions. Our country faces a lot of problems, and they're not temporary problems.
So you could say it's an unprecedented time, which is how we began the conversation today. So I'm going to end it there. Charles Lipson, thank you so much for joining me.